As we proceed into the Birchot Kriat Shema, the blessings recited in the morning prior to the recitation of the Shema, the ultimate acceptance of the yoke of heaven, the Kabbalah's Ol Malchus Shemayim, there are two brachos which Chazal instituted into the tefillah prior to that Kabbalah's Ol Malchus Shemayim. The first is that of Yotzer HaMe'oros, of the creation of the light, and the second is that of Ahava Rabbah, the love of Torah, the love of Bnei Yisrael, that God's choosing of the Jewish people. And Rabbi Dr. Abraham J. Twersky asks, why is it that the first bracha is related to the creation of the luminaries of the light in the world? And in fact, the bracha begins, Yotzer or Uvorei Choshech, that God is the one who creates light, who fashions light and creates darkness. And he explains that we know from the very beginning of the Torah, beginning of the Bereshis, in fact, the fourth pasuk in the Torah, the first parak of Bereshis, that talks about how God's first act of creation was the separation between light and dark. And Rashi explains that prior to that, it was Be'ir Buvia. It was in one big jumble, one big mess, one big mixture of lightness and dark. And Rabbi Twersky asks, he says, I don't understand. He says, light and darkness cannot coexist. They are polar opposites by definition. To which he explains, Al Pidrosh, he says, perhaps what we can at least understand, even though we can't understand the physical reality of what that means, that light and darkness was mixed, but on an emotional, psychological level, what we can explain is that while the light represents clarity, represents our morals, the darkness represents the confusion or the challenges, the dark side of us, so to speak. And that we can understand that the morals and the confusion can be separated. That initially God created the world and it was mixed together, but then in order to proceed with creation, he needed to separate those two. And Rabbi Dr. Twersky explains that human beings are the same way. That we sometimes have a mixture, have an irbuvia, a jumble of the lightness and of the darkness, of the clarity and of the confusion, of our positive side of things and of our evil internal desires, so to speak. And in order to get to Kabbalah's Ol Malchus Shemayim, in order to be able to recite clearly and honestly, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, we need to be able to recognize both of those within us and to separate them out, and to do our best to remove the evil forces, to remove the temptations and the desires that and the confusion from within us in order to see with absolute clarity, to be able to recite that Shema. It is for that reason, perhaps, that at the most climactic moments of history, that when people are really put to the test, that even though we struggle on a daily basis, that if one, God forbid, is to give up their life, as we know so many holy Jews have done over the years, their classic statement recited at that moment is Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Because at that moment where all of those desires and the temptation and confusion subsides, we see with absolute clarity the light, to be able to accept the yoke of heaven. And so the first bracha prior to reciting Shema has to be this bracha that we work towards. Of Yotzer or Vorei Choshech, God creates both of them, but our mission is to understand what is the Yotzer HaMe'oros, to ultimately understand what sheds light, what gives light, what is the clarity in this world, so that we come to a real satisfactory acceptance of Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad.